Back in the series, Living in the Last Days. This is a very busy season, not only with everything that's happened this week, but, we have Pentecost Sunday, which is next week, too. And then we have Father's Day coming up. So it's a little hit. And then we have the 4th of July. So it's kind of hit and miss on this. But we're back today, Living in the Last Days. And I want to talk to you about this coming world ruler. And there shall be tornadoes in diverse places, and then the Antichrist will suddenly appear. Just kidding, sort of. We've been in this series, Living in the Last Days, and that's the time we've identified between Christ's first coming and now, and His second coming. We've said that He's coming again, and our main text has been from Mark chapter 13, and I want you to turn there today, and I'm going to have a long intro. As a matter of fact, it'll probably be half of the sermon, which is also symbolic of things that I'll be talking about today, and we'll see if you pick up on that. In Mark 13, I'll get there in just a little bit, but in Mark 13, the first 13 verses, it's the last week, just as a refresher, of Jesus' life on earth. He's been teaching in the temple. His disciples are with Him. He leaves then with His disciples the temple, and He heads over across the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, which is directly across from the temple, and He begins talking about what it's going to be like in the last days. This is one of the last times that He's going to be able to address His disciples, and so that's what He does. He begins to say that, to begin with, in the last days, I want you to know that this beautiful temple that we are observing right now, it's going to be, before long, destroyed. And so this Olivet Discourse, as it's called, because they're on the Mount of Olives, is recorded not only in Mark 13, but also in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. And then, as Jesus is talking about this stuff, in verse 3 in Matthew 24, as He's sitting on the Mount of Olives, Matthew records that the disciples came to Him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So they have 3 questions, and then Jesus begins to answer those questions, and He says, well, not only will the temple be destroyed, but then there are going to be deceptions perpetrated on mankind. And what He means by that is that there will be people coming claiming to be the Christ, coming to be me, essentially, or in place of me. And then there's going to be wars and rumors of wars, and nations are going to rise up against nations, and there's going to be earthquakes and famines and the like, and they're going to be breaking out all over the place, and there's going to be persecutions, not only from governments, but also even from family members too. And then Luke 21 records, and there will also be fearful events and great signs in the heaven. And we've been talking about this. And then he says, and all of this is going to be like a woman who is in labor. Like the longer she's in labor, the closer the pains get together and the more intense they get. That's how these things are going to be in the last days. All the way up until the time that I come again. And he says, and the gospel will be declared to the ends of the earth, and then the end will come. And for 2,000 years, it's been believed that the gospel has been declared to the ends of the earth. Paul plainly says it in the Scriptures, and we feel as if it's true today, which means that the end could come at any time, and it's always been that way. So when people say, it can't get any worse, yes, it can, but it may not. The end could come at any time. And we said that because the gospel has been preached, the next thing on God's prophetic calendar is this event called the rapture. We said that was in the white space between Mark verse 13 and Mark verse 14, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. While all this is happening and getting worse, the next big thing on the calendar is this rapture, the covert rescue operation where Christ suddenly, in the time that it takes for light to reflect off of your eye, in the twinkling of an eye, all of a sudden, Jesus is going to come back in the clouds, and every believer that's ever lived, they're going to come out of the grave. If we're alive at His coming, we're going to go up and we're going to be with Him, and we're going to live with Him forever. And then, what happens after that? And we said, what's next? After the rapture and before the second coming, what happens? Well, we talked about this last time. It gets even worse. And you don't want to be left behind when the rapture happens, because then you'll be living in this period. After the rapture and before the second coming, there will be a time of dread and unequaled distress, a 7-year period known as the tribulation. And there will be, according to the book of Revelation that we looked at, a series of judgments, 3 sets of 7, saying these are God's judgments and they are complete. Utterly complete. There's going to be 7 seal judgments, 7 trumpet judgments, 7 bowl judgments, and they're bad, and they go from bad to badder to worse, man. It's awful, and you don't want to be here. They devastate the whole earth. They wipe out a huge part of the population. And while everything is being shaken that can be shaken, those that are left on the earth, rather than turning their hearts towards God in recognition of all of this, their hearts get hard towards God. And I suggested last time that you can feel that hardness in your own heart, can't you? Even now. There's something in you that wants to resist God, even though you know all this is coming. And even though there might be moments or days that you're not right with Him, and still you allow your heart to be hardened towards the things of God. So it's already in there. And in this period, things are so bad that it's like it gets even worse in man's heart. They utterly despise God in this time rather than turn to Him. And what God is doing is He is bringing this present world to an end. He's going to renovate the whole thing. So He's pouring out His wrath. While He's doing that, though, He's also saving Israel. That's God's plan for Israel. In Romans, right after Paul does all this theological work, he also goes back and he realizes the fact that God still has a plan for the Jews. When the time of the Gentiles has ended, God will, not that He's ever stopped working with the Jews, but God has set aside a time when He's going to reach out to the Jews again, and they're going to turn to Him. Their hearts are going to be turned to Him. So while some men's hearts are being hardened, some Jewish hearts, many Jewish hearts, are going to be turned to God. So let's go back to Mark 13, and I want to read everything that I'm talking about and I'm going to talk about concerning the tribulation period. We've talked about it before. This is going to be Mark's version. I got to lose weight. I think I said that. Mark 13. Let's see, Matthew, Mark. When you look up everything on the computer, you forget where everything is. Not really. Okay, we're going to look at verse 14. When you see the abomination that causes desolation, we're going to talk about that today, standing where it does not belong. That could also read where he does not belong. Matter of fact, some scholars say it's a better reading to say where he does not belong. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the roof of his house go down or enter his house or take anything out. It's like a tornado's coming, right? You just get down or get out. And then verse 16 says, let no one go in the field or go back and get his cloak. How dreadful it will be in those days for a pregnant woman and nursing mothers. I mean, I'm figuring, I only know based on what I can observe, that it's probably pretty hard for a pregnant nursing mom to run. So it's going to be bad. Pray that this will not take place in winter, which is even worse, because those will be the days of distress unequal from the beginning when God created the world until now, and never will be equaled again. This is the tribulation period. And never to be equaled again. Verse 20 says, if the Lord had not cut short those days, if He didn't end it all at some point, no one would survive. But for the sake of the elect, whom He has chosen, He has shortened them. There's a time frame for people to still turn. Not only Gentiles, but Jewish people to turn. Verse 21 says, at that time, everyone who says to you, look, here is the Christ, or look, there he is, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will appear and perform signs and miracles to deceive the elect, if it were possible. Which would indicate, if you're truly the elect, you're not going to be fooled. People usually take that in the pejorative, in the negative sense. Oh, we can all be fooled by this. Not if you're a true believer. If you're a fake believer, you can be tricked. But if you're a true believer, you won't be. Verse 23 says, so be on your guard. I have told you everything ahead of time, but in those days, following that distress, which we could probably identify as the first 3.5 years of that 7-year period, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. At that time, men will see, I added an extra verse here, at that time, men will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. This is what it's going to be like in the tribulation period until Jesus comes at the end, the second time, to end the whole thing. He's cutting the days short. It's going to go, like I said, from bad to worse. Now, today I want to fill in a little bit more of that white space between everything that's happening today until the rapture, right? That was some white space. It doesn't talk about that in Mark. But there's some more white space because it begins again with this abomination of desolation. I hope everybody's tracking with me. Because also associated with that is this appearance of this coming world leader, also known as the Antichrist. And he shows up on the scene just after the rapture. The time of the Antichrist is an ominous shadow that looms before human destiny, one writer said. Many projections have been made as to what that time will be like. Indeed, it will be a period of staggering satanic influence. And just when you think things can't get any worse, they do. And you could ask, is the Antichrist alive today? And this would be my answer. See if this doesn't make sense. Since the Antichrist don't know when the end is going to come, don't you think that he would have someone always ready in the wings? Because the Antichrist is going to be a man that will eventually be overtaken by Satan himself. And we're going to see that today. Hopefully, we'll actually get to that if I can shut up long enough. So I would think that the Antichrist, if you ask me, is the Antichrist alive today? I would say yes. But every believer from Jesus' day until now could say the same thing. Why? Jesus can come back at any time. So don't tell me. I've heard people say, the Antichrist is alive today and he was born in 1962. Well, that was the year I was born. I better get on the ball, huh? They don't know that. They don't know what year. They don't know the time. More than anybody else. God said that shut up until the end. You're not going to know until he reveals himself. So stop making speculation on this. There's somebody alive ready all the time until that day when that one person will appear on the scene. Until that time, there's going to be types. There's going to be always somebody waiting to step into that position. Some believers may dislike discussing the Antichrist because it is so unsettling. And although it is believed that the church is going to be snatched away before they have to suffer under his rule, according to 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, it is necessary for us to take a moment and look at the stark realities that lie ahead. And to allow me then to ask you, are you ready? So that you can avoid this coming cataclysm, and the one that we have come to call the Antichrist. And who are you telling? Do you want your friends to go through this? You should be telling people, Christ is coming, but so is the Antichrist. So like a GPS that lets you know what's going on up ahead of you and how to get you to where you want to go and to avoid all the obstacles in the way, I want to give you a graphic overview today of what this whole rule and reign of the Antichrist is like and some of his characteristics, and then I'll fill you in on another lesson on the Antichrist tonight, because it's just too large. I'm not glorifying him. I just want you, like a GPS, to be made aware of what lies ahead, so that you too can to make sure that you're ready. And also, hopefully, promote you to telling other people so that they too can't escape. So, back to verse 14 in Mark. Jesus talking to his disciples. He says this, when you see the abomination that causes desolation. And then Matthew adds this, spoken of by the prophet Daniel. And we find that in Daniel chapter 11, verse 31. And it's concerning the temple. When you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it or he does not belong, let the reader understand. Now give me a minute here. One of the most graphic places in the Old Testament, probably the most graphic place in the Old Testament where this Antichrist is described. It's in the book of Daniel by the person of Daniel as he's looking into the future. God is giving him all of this insight into the future. And there's one individual that he identifies that ultimately will be a type of the Antichrist. So, in my own words, to help you understand, let me explain to you what is going on here. And I'm trying not to be too technical here, okay? So Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. He's saying this is what it's going to be like leading up to the end. And then all of a sudden he skips over the rapture, and he skips over the first 3.5 years of the Antichrist reign. Because when he first comes, right after the rapture, he's really you're not going to know who it is necessarily. You might have a clue if you've been informed, but he's going to be like everybody else. He's just going to rise to power. But then Jesus says, when you see the abomination that causes desolation take place, understand. Remember what Daniel said. So here's what Jesus is saying to his closest disciples. Remember when Daniel wrote about the one who would come with an army to desecrate the temple. And remember what happened in 167 before me. Little play on words here. Antiochus, the Greek, came and did that. Remember, he went into the temple and he offered a swine to Zeus, and then he went on to proclaim himself to be God, thereby desecrating the temple, shutting it down from all worship. Yeah. Well, I'm telling you, just like you know that is going to happen, in the time of the end, it's going to happen again. And it's going to happen real soon. This time, it won't be the Greeks. It'll be the Romans. And the temple will be defiled again. And by the end, one temple stone won't be left on another. So understand this, he's saying. This is another fulfillment of what Daniel first wrote about. And there will be yet another fulfillment at the end of the age. Daniel talked about that too. And so will Paul. Remember, John is listening to this firsthand. At that time, there will be a man of sin. That's what Paul will call him. John will call him the Antichrist, who is the perpetrator this time. Oh, and by the way, John, make sure you read Daniel again, and then remind everyone that this abomination that causes desolation in the last days, when he who ought not stands in the holy place, I want you to know it's going to happen 3.5 years into the tribulation period. So, what am I saying here? What is Jesus saying here? He's saying, guys, remember Daniel wrote about one who was going to come and he was going to desecrate the temple. And you know that it happened. Well, I'm telling you it's going to happen again in about 40 years with the Romans. The temple is going to be desecrated and destroyed. But I'm not going to say any more about that. I'm going to leave that to John, and I'm going to leave that to Paul. Paul will talk about this guy who's going to come and do the same thing at the end. Paul calls him the man of sin, the son of perdition. John calls him the Antichrist. And we'll find out later, he also calls him the beast. He's going to go into the temple. And there's lots of questions about this. He's going to go into the temple and he's going to cause the abomination that brings about the desolation of the temple. What that looks like is yet in the future. And that's what we're talking about now. It's going to happen in this tribulation period when everything that can be shaken is being shaken. All of a sudden, this guy is going to show his true colors, and it's very mysterious. And if you're in the dark, let me shine a little light on this. Let me help you get an overview of some of the timing here in the last days. After I look at the time. After the church is snatched away, 1 Thessalonians 4, right? The rapture. A satanically empowered man will gain worldwide control. That's 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. The Thessalonians, the believers there in Thessalonica, Paul writes the first letter, and he tells them, people are dying. I know you're concerned. Will they go to heaven? Yes, they will. As a matter of fact, Jesus will come back. That's the rapture, and he'll take all of them and you away. So don't worry about that. Well, they keep buzzing about this, and by a few months later, they're concerned that they're in the tribulation period. So apparently Paul taught them about that. And they're doing like everybody else and fretting about this and about this Antichrist, and maybe some are trying to identify the Antichrist. Sound familiar? And Paul says, no, this guy is not going to show up until the time of the tribulation. And you won't know who he is. But don't worry about it because you won't be there. So, after we're snatched away, and this satanically empowered man gains worldwide power, what he does is he makes a peace treaty with many, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, with Israel. That's the Antichrist. That's the coming world ruler. One of the ways that he will gain power after the rapture of the church, he begins to talk about peace. Remember, this is a time of great tumult. If ever there are wars and rumors of wars going on, when somebody starts talking about peace, it becomes very attractive. Many think this will be just after the snatching away and will be the beginning of the 7-year tribulation. He will be aided by another man called the false prophet who heads up the religious system and eventually requires everyone on the earth to worship the Antichrist. Revelation 19:20. At the midway point, though, 3.5 years into the 7-year tribulation, that's why my introduction is half of it, because at the midway point, right? 3.5 years in, the Antichrist breaks the treaty with Israel and shows his true colors. He is, or he causes, the abomination of the temple, literally and or spiritually, that causes desolation. The Jews are scattered, and many of them return to the Lord, realizing that Jesus is indeed the Christ. And then following that, a great persecution breaks out against everybody who believes in Jesus on the earth, and it's instigated by the devil himself, the dragon, and especially against believing Jews. That's Daniel chapter 12, Mark chapter 13, 14, that's the abomination, all this is going to happen, and then Revelation chapter 12. Okay? Are you tracking with me? 7 years of tribulation. He shows up, and he's very attractive to people. And everybody begins to follow him, but he doesn't reveal who he is until the middle of that. And when he reveals who he is, one of the signs that he's doing that is the fact that, and there's other signs, is the fact that he goes into the temple. And I spent an hour and a half writing on this, and then I took it out last night because of my view of this. He goes into the temple, and he desecrates the temple, and that's the sign that now everything is really going to go downhill for the last 3.5 years. As a matter of fact, there's a time of sorrows, the first 3.5 years, and then the time of the great tribulation, the last 3.5 years. And we find out that all of this is under the instigation of the devil, who's identified in the book of Revelation as the dragon in chapter 12. So who is this Antichrist? I'm pausing for a second so your brains can catch up. He's mentioned over 100 times in the Scriptures. But most of the time he's not called by the term Antichrist. He's not given that title. In the New Testament, he's mentioned in 5 different verses, all 5 times by John, the guy who was sitting there on the Mount of Olives, when he's writing his epistle, his first epistle. Only one time does John call this individual the Antichrist. And that comes in 1 John chapter 2, verse 18. He says, "Dear children, this is the last hour. These are the last days. And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists," there's always someone in the wings, his spirit is always working in the world to bring people down. There are always going to be somebody, there's always going to be somebody, and driven by his spirit to take Christ down and to take his place, right? There are many, he says, the Antichrist is coming. Even now, many Antichrists have come. This is how you know that it's the last hour. When people are seeking in their lives to overthrow the rule and reign of Christ and even making bold claims about deity, then you will know. They're contrary to the gospel, and they're talking down the gospel and everything about Jesus. That's the spirit of Antichrist. But I want you to know that then there is one that's going to come ultimately in the last days, and he's going to be the Antichrist. John contrasts lowercase a with uppercase A. And he says this spirit is already in the world at work today. The prefix anti means both against and instead of. And in the case of the coming world ruler, both are true. He will overtly oppose Christ, and at the same time will try to insert himself in the place of Christ. In other words, he'll rebel against Christ and the gospel, and he will seek to replace Christ as the Savior of all of mankind, and even declare himself to be God. That's what he will do. And there are over 25 titles that he's given to describe this most despicable, hateful, terrifying man that will ever walk the face of the earth. In the book of Revelation, we've already mentioned him. He's the rider on the white horse in chapter 6. He's the beast in chapter 11, and he's the beast rising out of the sea in chapter 13. Some people think that he is Satan incarnate. We know for certain that Satan gives him his power, his throne, and his authority. Here are some of his other aliases. He's the little horn of Daniel. Have to come back tonight, find out what that's about. He's the king of fierce features or countenance, Daniel 8. He's the one who understands sinister schemes, Daniel chapter 8. He's the prince who is to come, Daniel chapter 9. He is the willful king, Daniel chapter 11. He is the man of sin, 2 Thessalonians 2:3. He is the son of perdition, 2 Thessalonians 2:3. He is the lawless one, 2 Thessalonians 2:8. Again, that's Paul writing. And he is the beast. He is the first beast of Revelation chapter 13. And now I just want to take a brief view, even though I have pages and pages. I want to take a brief view. Turn, if you will, to Revelation 13. And remember that he's always trying to replace God. And remember that it's impossible to identify this coming world ruler, but we can know some things about him, and that's what I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes. And if you say you know who it is, then I guess we're in the tribulation, because Paul said no one will know until then. And since we're not in the tribulation, you don't know. But there are some things that we can know, and that's what I want to look at really quickly now. And I'm going to outline it real quick for you. 3 headings. He will be empowered by Satan. He'll be worshipped by the world. And he will be identified by a mark. Okay? Revelation chapter 13. Now, to set this up really quick, in the previous chapter, Revelation 12, John has a vision of Satan. He calls him the dragon. The same serpent that tempted Eve is now in chapter 12 of Revelation cast down from heaven to the earth. And at the same time, woes are pronounced on the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, because the devil, Revelation 12:12 says, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury because he knows his time is short. He used to be able to operate in the heavenly realms. Now he's confined to earth and he is mad. You get the picture. You don't want to be there. Are you ready? So then, when we start chapter 13, this is what we see. And the dragon, this is Satan, stood on the shore of the sea. And all of this is symbolic language, and I can't talk about it. And I saw a beast, this is the Antichrist, coming out of the sea. It had 10 horns and 7 heads and 10 crowns, and on its horns and on each head was a blasphemous name. Verse 2 says, that's one verse. Verse 2 says, and the beast I saw resembled a leopard, but it had feet like those of a bear and a mouth like those of a lion. And the dragon, Satan, gave the beast, the Antichrist, his power and his throne and great authority. And one of the heads of the beast seemed to have a fatal wound, but the fatal wound had been healed. The whole earth was filled with wonder and followed the beast because of that. And then verse 4 says, people worshiped the dragon because he had given authority to the beast. And they also worshiped the beast and asked, who is like the beast? And who can wage war against him? Satan knows his time is short, and he's going to do as much damage as possible. What John sees is the first beast, which is the Antichrist. He comes up out of the sea, and with this graphic imagery that John uses here, what we find out is, to boil it down, is there's going to be a governmental element to his rule and reign, and there's also going to be a spiritual element to his rule and reign. He's going to have horns and crowns, and on each one of these heads are written a blasphemous name. We don't know what those names are, but in other words, he's saying everything he says and everything he does is going to be to defame and deface God and to exalt himself. The same description of this Antichrist is given, believe it or not, in Daniel, where the lion and the bear and the leopard are represented in sequence, and they represent then in turn Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece. And then Daniel also mentions a fourth beast that he sees, and by the way, that happens to be the Roman Empire. They're in charge when this is being written. John pictures, though, that this beast that comes up out of the sea has all of the terrifying characteristics of all of those other kingdoms, all wrapped up into one person. And they were a terror to the earth. They were the scourge of the earth. They killed, maimed, destroyed people's lives in order to bring about conquest for themselves. The Medo-Persians, the Greeks under Alexander the Great. Oh man, the terror that they wreaked. Everything is all wrapped up. The Romans who crushed people out of existence, right? All of that's rolled up into this guy's rule and reign, and that's what John is saying. And the devil is giving this guy his power directly and his throne and his authority because he's a deceiver and he wants to deceive everybody. And so rather than worship of God, everybody is duped into worshiping Satan through the person of the Antichrist. What do you want? You want to be worshipped, don't you? Well, I can give it to you. Because that's my deal anyway. It got me kicked out of heaven the first time. Revelation 12:2. I just want to be God. And I want everybody to know how great I am. Hi, Mom. Kind of reminds me of what you see on TV sometimes. Which would be great if I had television, but I don't. And let me say this. I'm really going to have to wrap this up. But let me say this. That the way that he does it, because this Antichrist, under the direction of the dragon, the devil, Satan himself, he's going to mimic what Christ does. He has a head that looks like it's fatally wounded, but all of a sudden he's made better. That's to mimic Christ's death and resurrection so that he would be worshipped as God. He does the same thing. He can come up with nothing new, apparently. So he plays the same old trick, and the whole earth begins to worship him. I'm skipping so much. That's where we come to the next section of verses. I'm skipping some. Verse 8 says, all of the inhabitants worship the earth. But then John adds a little parenthesis, and he said, all those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. The Lamb who was slain from the creation of the world. Whoever has ears, let him hear. And if anyone goes into captivity, so he's saying, listen, if your name is written in the book, don't worry about it. You're good. You're safe. But then he says this weird thing. Whoever has ears, let him hear. So pay attention. You got that. You're safe. But if anyone goes into captivity, they'll go into captivity. If anyone is killed with the sword, then with the sword they will be killed. In other words, if you're going to align yourself with the Antichrist, you're going to fall with him. Because I want you to know, you're going to be okay because your name is written in the Lamb's book of life. But if you're on the side of the Antichrist, just like him, you're going to fall too. And then he says, so hang in there. This calls for patience, endurance, and faithfulness on the part of God's people. Like, don't fret, don't worry. God has got you covered. If your name is written in the book, you don't have to worry. But for everyone whose name is not written in the book, that's the end of the chapter. Revelation 13. You will be identified by a mark, just like your name is written in the book. In the middle of this, and I had to skip it, but the false prophet rises up. And the false prophet, we find out in verse 16, also forced all the people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their forehead. And they couldn't buy or sell anything unless they had the mark. In John's day, this mark was a sign of ownership. Either you're owned by God or you're owned by Satan and his Antichrist and the false prophet. And you can't buy or sell. You can't do any kind of business. You can't go to the grocery store to feed your kids unless you have the mark. You are the property of the Antichrist. And the good gospel news is you don't have to go through all of that. Because throughout the whole book of Revelation, what you see is the changing of scenes, what's happening on earth. This is what's happening on earth. Men's hearts, women's hearts are getting hard towards God. The Antichrist arises. The false prophet props him up. Everybody worships him. He says, great, I can bring about peace or I can bring about war. And now you're suffering, but I'm the man. I'm God. I can control all of this. Right? As a matter of fact, remember, it looked like I was dead, but I'm alive? Yeah. Worship me. Take my mark, and everything will be good with you. Isn't that how the devil works? He gets you in a bad spot, and he says, go ahead. Try it. It's okay. You're good. Hey, I'm God after all. I'm the only one that can get you through this. He makes every false claim that God has made on behalf of his people. But he can't come through. So there's these scenes on earth, in Revelation, and scenes in heaven. And John bounces back and forth between them. And what we find out is that in heaven, while all of this is happening, people are getting saved. They're worshiping around the throne. I mean, people are getting saved. Saved people are worshiping around the throne. And eventually they sit down at this Lamb's Supper. Right? Their names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Who's the Lamb that was slain before the foundation of the world? That's Jesus. He's the only one that can take away our sins. While the man of sin is ruling on the earth, Christ is coming into the fullness of his reign in heaven, and we get invited to his table. We don't. Let me ask you, are you a name written in the book, or are you a number? Are you a name, or are you a number? Do you want to go down this way, or do you want to sit down at the table and enjoy all of the good fellowship of God and have peace of mind like you've never experienced because you're actually in the presence of the one true living God? While everything is falling apart on earth, you're safe with God. Are you a name or are you a number? Guys, if you would come forward. I apologize I had to skip through so much. Lance, John, if you're in the room, John, brothers, come on up. You know, Jesus, about the same time as he was on the Mount of Olives, talking about all that just earlier, he shared a meal with his disciples. And one of the things he said was, I won't share this meal again until I do it in my Father's kingdom. So while the earth is raging under the kingdom of the Antichrist, in heaven, the saints whose names are written in the Lamb's Book of Life, they're partaking of a sumptuous meal. And Jesus said, I won't do it again until we do it together in the kingdom. That's what this represents today. When you take communion today, if you want to be part of that meal, take it. If you plan not to be, don't take it. I'll leave that up to you today. Guys. Sorry, Lance. Wrap it wrong. Go ahead, John. So I think I said about all I can say today to confuse you. How many of you, this is the first time you've ever heard anything like this about the Antichrist? You know, people would think that it's make-believe, but it's not. All of this is real, and one day it'll happen. And as your pastor and as a Christian, we shouldn't want anyone to have to experience anything like this. All we can do is do our best to understand it according to what the Scripture says about it. We won't understand the full horror of it until we're there, and we don't want to be there. And so, like with me, I hope that it's also your desire that you're not there, and you don't want anyone that you care about to be there either. And so that's why in this series I keep asking, are you ready? And who are you telling? And that's why I ask you today, are you a name that's written in the book of life, the Lamb's book of life? Or will you resign yourself to just being a number that you're going to have to receive? And I don't know what that is going to look like, but people thought it was the Social Security numbers, but now people are enjoying its benefits. Imagine if those were taken away, though. What if that was right? Where would you be? What would you do? Well, how will they know if I have the number? I don't know. They know where you are, even if your tracking devices are turned off on your cell phone. You can walk up to something, you can read your iris or your pupil or something. Facial recognition, thumbprint recognition. There are a million ways. There are cameras everywhere. And the sophistication to track people is only increasing. Imagine what it will be like when all of that technology is used for evil and you will not be able to escape it. You don't want to be there. You can identify with the name of Christ, or you can resign yourself to the mark and let your heart be hardened on a continual basis until you won't. It's not that you can't. It's that you refuse to by continually saying no when God calls. So this is how I want to end this today. When we take these elements, what you're doing is you're saying yes. I'm asking that my name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. If it's not, and you're accepting Jesus as your Savior. If your name is written in the book and you know it, you're simply confirming it by taking the elements. And even if you have elements in your hand, if you just plan on your heart being hard and getting harder, I don't care if you have the elements in your hand, don't take it. I think everybody is going to want to. I know I sure want you to. So with that, just symbolically, like on the night when Jesus took the bread and broke it and passed it out to his disciples, that's what we're doing here today. in receiving his sacrifice, his broken body, that we could be made whole in him. And we're saying we want to be at that supper. We want our names to be written in the Lamb's Book of Life. If that's you, let's take the bread together today. And you know, during that meal, there would be more than one cup that would go around. And one of those cups was the cup of redemption. And Jesus said, "Can you drink this cup? The cup of redemption." "Oh, yes, we can." But you don't know what that means. It means that I'm going to have to die in your place for your sin. And you might have to do the same for me. Are you willing to lay down your life for Christ? You know, that's the mark of the believer whose name is written in the Lamb's Book of Life. It's not the mark of the beast. The number of his name, 666. Symbolic of the fact that now, as we identify with him, we too are willing to lay down our own will, our own life, so that he can rule and reign in our hearts. And we do his work, not our work, not for our benefit, not so that everybody can worship us, say, "Look how great I am." You see, where do you think that comes from? I think you know. We lay down our life for him. And so taking this cup, that's what we're doing. We're saying, "Lord, we're not a number, we're a name. We're a person who's now identifying with you and laying our life down the same way that you shed your blood and laid your life down for us. So we too submit our will to do whatever it is that you've asked us to do in these last days." Let's take the cup together. Stand, if you would, please. Now, I want to thank everyone for being here today and for tolerating your pastor. But I love you, and I had so much more to say. Come back tonight. I'm going to talk about something totally different, but still related to this individual, because there's so much to say, and there's so many warnings, and I want us all to be safe. I want us to be out of here when all this happens. When a tornado comes, you go upstairs? No. You go down, you go where you need to be so that you can be safe. And that's what I'm asking you to do today. Go to the place with God where you can be safe, away from all this harm. Right? Let me pray for you, and then we'll be dismissed. Lord, it's sort of a sobering and a somber time. It's been just a crazy week, and bad things have happened in this world. But Lord, you've kept us safe. Not that we don't have problems. Not that we don't still have issues that need to be dealt with and prayed for, but you've kept us safe. And you've given us another opportunity to be here today. And so, Lord, as we have gathered here, and you've spoken through your word, may our hearts be changed, and may the works of Satan be identified and pushed back away from our lives so that we can be free to live for you. May we submit our lives to you now. In the name of Jesus. Amen.